Welcome to When Two or Three Are Gathered, a series on the formation of the Book of Common Prayer between 1549 and 1662. Our story starts in 1534 during the reign of Henry VIII. This is session 1 and will cover the reigns of Henry VIII and Edward VI. So here we have the last of the Tudors. Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary and Elizabeth I, all of them on the throne of England at some point or other. First of all, we have Henry. He's the father of the pack, famous, of course, for having 6 wives, some of whom he chopped the heads off of and others whom he divorced. He is usually credited with beginning the Church of England and the English Reformation, and we'll see how true that was. This is Edward VI. He came to the throne when he was 9 years old and died at the age of 15. This is Mary Tudor. She came to the throne after her younger brother Edward. She was a Catholic, and we'll see how that played into the whole of the English Reformation. And this is Elizabeth, good Queen Bess. She managed to settle the church down, settle England down, and enjoyed a long reign into the beginning of the 17th century. Henry VIII came to the throne in 1509 at the young age of 18. His father, Henry VII, had died. His older brother, Arthur, had died in 1502. Because Henry was so young, he relied on the counsel of those around him. He was known to be a bit of a party animal, but the person closest to him was Cardinal Wolsey, who actually made a lot of the decisions in those early years. The church which Henry inherits is the church in England, not the Church of England. It's still Catholic, which means the Pope still has power, although we'll see later his power is limited by the willingness of the monarch to cooperate with him. The church is highly politicized. Bishops and priests often hold high political office, and the people in the pew, for the most part, the ordinary people, did not have any great impetus to change. Remember that we still have 10 years to go before Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the church in Wittenberg. Having said that most people were basically happy with the way the church was in England, we need to just go back a little bit to the 14th century and remember John Wycliffe. He had produced a version of the Bible in English, and that was definitely not allowed. The Inquisition picked him up and put him to death. They burned him at the stake, which was their favourite way of execution, so everybody could see what they were not to do. The people who followed John Wycliffe were called Lollards, and they were really against the top-heavy institution of the church. They really wanted to have more personal relationship with Jesus and to read the Bible in English. And that seems very normal to us now, but at the time, the Inquisition was really trying to uphold the authority and power of the Catholic Church as it then was, and they came up with an especially nasty way of getting rid of the Lollards, and that was to bury them up to their waists and then set fire to them. Henry, as we have seen, was a loyal Catholic. He's often credited with beginning the English Reformation, but we're not really sure whether he did. He started off as a faithful Catholic. In fact, he wrote a book called In Defense of the Seven Sacraments, and that was because in Europe people were starting to say there were only 2. The Pope gave him the title of Fides Defensor, Defender of the Faith, in 1521, yet within a few years Henry had completely pulled away from Rome. So we need to ask ourselves what changed. Henry married Catherine of Aragon in 1509. If you remember back a couple of slides to Arthur, well, she'd been married to him first. Henry had a papal dispensation to marry her. He did everything correctly. But like most monarchs of the day, his greatest wish was to have a son to take the throne from him. Catherine did have one child, Mary, who we'll see more about later. But Henry conveniently came up with a piece of theology of his own and decided that he should never have married her and asked the Pope to annul the marriage. Usually annulments only happen when a marriage is not consummated, and so the Pope said no. Okay, so if you're Henry, you now have a problem. You can't ditch the wife that won't give you a son. Oh, and by the way, you're running out of money. So what does Henry do? He just decides that he is now the head of the church in England. In 1534, he declares the Act of Supremacy. And this has the advantage not only of allowing him to get rid of Catherine, but he can also take all the church lands and wealth. But then, interestingly, he doesn't follow the reformers in Europe in putting the liturgy into English. He doesn't change the way they do things. He leaves the whole church structure in place, which is why it looks more like a political maneuver than an act of conscience or anything that's theologically thought through. Thomas Cranmer had become Archbishop of Canterbury in 1532, early enough to see the Act of Supremacy into being. In 1538, Henry did look as if he was going down the path of the reformers, as a Bible in English was placed in every parish church. In 1544, Henry had a litany published in English, but this was really only for very limited use. Henry was certainly not a fan of people interpreting the Bible for themselves. He didn't want public discussion of what the Bible might mean. Authority, and theological authority especially, belonged to him. No individuals should be able to question that. Henry VIII said this to Parliament: "You must understand that it is licensed you so to do," i.e. be in English, "only to inform your own conscience and to instruct your children and family, and not to dispute and make Scripture a rallying and taunting stock against priests and preachers." And that's why we mentioned the Lollards, you see, because he did not want to open up that can of worms again. He did not want his subjects to be going up against the authority and establishment of the church. Henry was certainly a larger-than-life character in history. Throughout his reign, he answered only to himself. He was inconsistent to everybody else, but apparently his logic made sense to him. As he lay dying, he knows that the 9-year-old Edward will ascend the throne, and he must have worried about what would happen to his kingdom. However, he had left a church in England which was unique in Europe. Like its cousins in Europe, it had rejected the power of the Pope. But unlike those cousins, because Henry was really more interested in the political side of a takeover than in the theological one, the structure of the church has been left intact. So there are still parishes, there are still parish priests, and there are still bishops. The only reforms he'd really made liturgically were those very minor ones we'd seen. So basically, in essence, the church in England as Henry dies is a Roman Catholic church which answers to its monarch. Edward VI came to the throne in 1547 following his father's death. He was only 9 when he was crowned, and that meant that he had to have adults to help him reign. The first one was Somerset, and the second one was Dudley. Despite the length of his reign only being 6 years, and despite his age, the church in England would see its most sweeping reforms during this time. So here we have a picture describing the accession of Edward VI. Notice Henry on his deathbed, but he's very clearly pointing to Edward. Edward himself on his throne, so it's almost like a cartoon strip as it progresses. But under his feet, trodden down by him, there is the Pope, and here we have some monks. Very, very clear message. Henry passes to Edward, and Edward treads the Roman Catholic Church underfoot. And here we have Edward's own council, his own godly men. Thomas Cranmer had been Archbishop of Canterbury for 15 years when Edward became king. He'd had plenty of time to think about what he might do if he had the chance. And so very quickly a committee was put together to make an English prayer book. The liturgy in the country at the time was Roman Catholic, mostly based on the Sarum rite, which came from Salisbury, but there were a remarkable amount of local variations. The other thing that Kramer didn't like was that there were so many books that you needed to perform liturgy in a church. Kramer's dream was to put all of the liturgy into English and to have one book for the common people. There were two editions produced during Edward's reign, the 1549 and 1552 books. 1549 would have looked more familiar to people in the country. It was much more like the old Roman Catholic Mass, and that's what people noticed. The monastic offices were condensed down into two services, morning and evening prayer. In 1552, there was a much more major revision. The reformers then were keen to move away from any Roman Catholic roots. The Gloria was put at the end of the Eucharist, and the Ten Commandments were put in at the beginning. In both cases, acts of uniformity were passed to enforce use, and dates were given by which every parish in the country had to be using the new books. Thomas Cranmer is often credited as the author of the Book of Common Prayer. He certainly had a major part in the effort, but there was actually a committee of bishops who sat down and put it together. From Pentecost 1549, it was illegal to use any other liturgy in England. As we've seen, the first book retained much of the feel of the Old Mass. The difference was it was in English. Even the title of communion has a bracket underneath it saying, also known as the Mass. The rubrics are the rules by which you conduct worship, and the ones from Matins said that you had to use clear enunciation. One of the criticisms of the old Roman Catholic Church was that priests often did not seem to know the words to the Mass, or else they mumbled them so people couldn't make out what they were. Cranmer really wanted the prayer book to be for the common person or the common man, and he felt strongly that it should be affordable. The table of saints' days was cut down to allow for continuous reading of Scripture without interruption, but even these moderate changes caused rebellions in many places. It's tempting to think that Kramer and his committee came up with a whole new book of worship. In fact, what they did was they pulled in liturgy from all over the place. The communion service is a simplified form of the Sarum rite, which was the one that was most in use in England at the time anyway. It was in English, not Latin, but it had the advantage of people being able to recognize what was going on. The readings which were put into this prayer book are mostly from the 1539 Great Bible. Then they used things from the continental reformers. Bucer and Osiander are very clearly used. The hours, the monastic services, were made into matins and evensong, following a pattern which Martin Luther had come up with earlier. The words of institution were adapted from the Sarum order for the sick, so they used things creatively and pulled in pieces from various areas of liturgy. Communion now would be both bread and wine. Interestingly, a book of homilies was issued, 18 sermons to be read in church. At this point, it was not anticipated that individual clergy would do their own exegesis of Scripture and preach on things which they came up with by themselves. This is Thomas Cranmer. As we know, he was Archbishop of Canterbury. He was in charge of the committee that authored the Books of Common Prayer, and he did this because he believed in a single book in English for the nation. Some scholars have said that he actually only thought the book would be used in parishes because those were the places where it was most needed for there to be clear liturgy and for it to be uniform. The cathedrals and royal chapels would have had many more resources. They still had choirs and they would have had much more educated clergy. So perhaps they would be treated differently. The other thing that people ask is whether Kramer ever thought that these prayer books would be a permanent fixture in England. Many would contend that he did not. As we go through the history of the prayer book, we will see that there was always much tugging and pulling on either side of any edition. Timothy Rosendale says the following: "It is perhaps not an exaggeration to see prayer book worship in English as a regular and institutionalized site of an ideological struggle, in which the competing claims of structure and subject are constantly renegotiated. And it is on the ground of ideological negotiation between church and state, individual and community, that the identity and future of England and its subjects would be endlessly recreated." And that's certainly true through these next few editions of the Book of Common Prayer. The state has to keep control, but it has to let go of some of that control in order to have people willing to change their religious habits. Elizabeth will find this later. She cannot simply follow her heart, because her heart would have alienated her too much from the people she served. The 1552 marks a seed change in the English Church. This is a much more Protestant liturgy, much more influenced by people like the Calvinists over in Europe. 10 Commandments from the Bible, of course, head up the liturgy. There was something called the Black Rubric, probably only called black because they actually printed it in black, but it's keen to point out that the bread and wine are just bread and wine. People kneel to receive it, but they're not venerating it. They're not seeing it as the actual body and blood of Christ. Communion is a memorial meal. There is no change in substance or form to the bread. Processions are banned, and the veneration of saints is not allowed. And this led to the destruction of much art and architecture in the English church. The altars were turned lengthways in the chancels. So they were pulled away from the wall, the east wall, and the priest would then stand on the north side. This was to make it absolutely clear that it was a different thing from what people had experienced before. As we've seen, this was a huge shift from the recognizable 1549 book. So this is what was going on all over the country, and as you can see, it was really quite disturbing to people because the altar suddenly had the long sides on the south and the north, not the east and the west. And the priest would now stand somewhere different as well. The priest would be on the north here. And not only had the furniture changed, but you were also being told that what communion meant had changed. Perhaps it's clearer on this picture. We go from here, this is the screen, and this is the screen on this one. And then we've got seats here and here. And then the altar used to be up here against the east wall. And the priest would have stood and done communion there. Now the priest stood here and the altar was here. And where the altar used to be, there are actually seats. So you're being told to believe something new. Your furniture's been all changed around. It must feel quite insecure to go to church now, whereas before you were pretty certain you knew what to think. Edward died at the age of 15 after only 6 years on the throne. Many scholars wonder what would have happened if his reign had been longer, but this is where we are. During Edward's reign, Henry's political attack on the church was finally matched by Kramer's theological passion for the church. So now there was a system where the politics and the theology at least vaguely matched each other. The change, however, was not as radical as you saw in other parts of Europe, because they were not fighting off the Pope or the Roman Catholic Church. They'd already gone. So the Reformation in England is simply planted into the old system of buildings and hierarchy. There was always a lot of anger. At the end of Edward's reign, there was anger from the Catholics who wanted to stay Catholic, and then there was anger from the people who thought things had not gone far enough. So strangely enough, this was not the end, and more trouble was to come. There's a slightly random interlude at the end of Edward's reign. Just for 9 days, Lady Jane Grey was the queen. She was never crowned because Mary, who'd been waiting in the wings, brought an army down from Norfolk. But Edward had tried to change the succession away from Mary because Mary was a Catholic. It didn't work very well, and Jane Grey was later executed. But it's just worth knowing that Edward was willing to change the whole law of the land in order to keep the country Protestant.